Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the sun was an enemy. A spoonful of rice was a luxury, and a man could be executed for the crime of looking a guard in the eyes. Welcome to the Japanese prisoner of war camp, where survival wasn't just about hoping for rescue, it was a daily, deliberate act of defiance. So, before you settle into your blankets, ask yourself, how did tens of thousands of men endure years of starvation, tropical disease, and relentless brutality without losing their minds? What hidden systems did they build? Secret radios, underground newspapers, even universities to keep hope alive when the world forgot them. From the Bataan Death March to the hellish construction of the Burma Railway, tonight we uncover the quiet, astonishing genius of survival against all odds. To understand how anyone survived, you first have to understand the scale of the catastrophe that swallowed them. The story begins not in a prison camp, but in the smoking ruins of a fortress city at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula. It was February 15th, 1942. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, had fallen. In a single afternoon, roughly 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops became prisoners of the Japanese Imperial Army. It was the largest surrender in British military history, and it happened so fast that nobody had a plan for what came next. Wave after wave of bewildered men were marched into captivity, carrying nothing but the uniforms on their backs and a dawning realization that the rules of war they had been trained to expect simply did not apply here. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the Philippines, another disaster was already unfolding. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers, starved and abandoned, were about to be force-marched 65 miles through the jungle in what would become known as the Bataan Death March. By the time the killing stopped, the Japanese would be holding over 140,000 Allied prisoners across the Pacific, from Singapore to Manchuria. And here is the darkest statistic: 1 in 3 of those men would never come home. This is not just a story of suffering. It is a story of secret libraries built in stifling attics, of handmade radios smuggled inside hollowed-out broom handles, of doctors performing surgery with sharpened spoons, and of a quiet battle waged not with guns, but with the stubborn, unbreakable refusal to let go of hope. Because the real question isn't just what they endured, it's how they managed to stay human when every single day was designed to strip that humanity away. Let me take you to the exact moment the world turned upside down. It is February 15th, 1942. Singapore is burning. The man who is about to surrender the fortress, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, sits in a Ford factory on Bukit Timah Road, facing a Japanese general named Tomoyuki Yamashita. The room is stuffy, filled with cigarette smoke and the distant rumble of artillery. Percival's face is pale, drawn tight with exhaustion. Across the table, Yamashita is impatient, almost theatrical. He leans forward and demands a simple, humiliating answer: yes or no. Surrender unconditionally, or the bombing continues. Percival hesitates. He asks for a delay. Yamashita's voice cuts through the room like a blade. There will be no delay. Yes or no. At 6:10 in the evening, Percival signs the document. Just like that, the British Empire's greatest fortress in the Far East collapses. And overnight, 90,000 men become prisoners of an enemy who views surrender as the deepest possible disgrace. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the Japanese military code. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that death before dishonor was the only acceptable path. A Japanese soldier who surrendered was considered dead to his family, his name erased, his soul shamed for eternity. So, when 80,000 men laid down their weapons, the Japanese looked at them not as fellow soldiers honoring a lost fight, but as creatures beneath contempt, beings who had chosen to live when they should have chosen to die. This worldview colored every single interaction from that first moment of captivity until the last camp was liberated 3.5 years later. And it meant that for Allied prisoners, the war didn't end when the guns went silent. It just changed form. The first hours after surrender were chaos. Men were herded into open fields, paddocks, and parade grounds, told to sit and wait under a tropical sun that hammered down on them like a physical weight. They had no water. Their canteens were empty, and the Japanese gods seemed either indifferent or actively hostile to their suffering. At Changi, on the eastern tip of Singapore, soldiers were marched into a former British Army barracks that was never designed to hold more than a fraction of the number now crammed inside its walls. 40,000 men were packed into Selarang barracks and the surrounding buildings. Think about that for a moment. A facility built for peacetime garrison duty, suddenly forced to accommodate the population of a small city. Men slept on concrete floors. They slept in stairwells. They slept on parade grounds covered by nothing but a scrap of canvas or a shared blanket, if they were lucky. The toilets, designed for a fraction of the numbers, overflowed within days. The smell was indescribable. Flies bred in the filth by the millions, swarming over everything. And this was considered the better camp. But Changi was just one piece of a sprawling catastrophe. 1,800 miles away, across the South China Sea, another nightmare was already unfolding in the Philippines. In the hours after the fall of Singapore, another army was being destroyed on the Bataan Peninsula. Since January, American and Filipino forces had been fighting a desperate holding action. For 99 days, they held out against Japanese forces who controlled the air, controlled the sea, and controlled every supply line. By April, the Allied force was a ghost army. The soldiers were living on half rations, then quarter rations, then whatever they could scrounge. They ate monkeys, mules, and eventually the pack animals that carried their equipment. They chewed on leather belts and boiled weeds into something they called jungle soup. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery ripped through the ranks, leaving men so weak they could barely lift their rifles. On April 9th, Major General Edward King, knowing his starving, sick men could not fight anymore, made the agonizing decision. He surrendered the entire Luzon force, around 75,000 men, roughly 12,000 of them Americans, fell into Japanese hands in a single day. It was the largest surrender of American troops in history. The Japanese command had expected maybe 25,000 prisoners. Instead, they got 3 times that number. The logistics of simply moving this many captives overwhelmed their planning completely, and the Japanese response was not to adjust their plans but to push forward regardless. What followed was the Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced transfer from Mariveles at the tip of the peninsula to Camp O'Donnell in the interior. The column of prisoners stretched for miles, a river of exhausted men shuffling through the jungle in 100-degree heat with virtually no food and no water. Men who fell were bayoneted or shot where they lay. Men who stumbled to the side of the road to drink from a muddy ditch were clubbed or executed. Japanese guards rode bicycles alongside the column, swinging at prisoners with wooden sticks, rifle butts, and swords. Civilians who tried to throw food or water to the passing prisoners were attacked. The guards forced prisoners to sit in the open sun for hours without shade, the infamous sun treatment, deliberate torture by exposure. Men's lips cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled until they could not close their mouths. They began to hallucinate, seeing mirages of ice water and cold streams that dissolved into the dirt at their feet. One survivor, Lester Tenney, later remembered, "Number 1, we had no food or water. Number 2, you just kept walking the best way you could. It wasn't a march. It was a trudge through hell. The killing was casual, almost bored." At one point, guards pulled approximately 300 Filipino prisoners and officers from the column, marched them to a ravine, and systematically beheaded each one over the course of several hours. A sword-cleaning break every so often, as if they were performing some tedious industrial task. The air on the march was filled with the sound of men crying out, gunshots, and the heavy, rhythmic shuffling of thousands of feet on dirt and crushed rock. Some prisoners were run over by Japanese trucks that simply drove through the column. Others were burned alive after being locked inside buildings that guards set on fire. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipino soldiers and around 600 to 700 Americans died on the march itself. Thousands more died in the weeks after, at Camp O'Donnell, where conditions were so horrific that death rates reached 400 men per day. The Japanese Minister of War, Hideki Tojo, had already announced the official policy. A POW who does not work should not eat. For the sick and wounded, it was a death sentence written in 10 words. But while these initial atrocities were unfolding, a quieter and more complex story was beginning inside the camps that would become home for the next 3 years. Let's go back to Changi, because here something unexpected started to happen. The Japanese, overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners in Singapore, made a critical decision. They largely left the internal administration of the camps to the prisoners themselves. The Japanese controlled the perimeter, the work parties, and the overall supply of food. But within the wire, the Allied officers were allowed to organize their own command structure, allocate housing, and manage discipline. This small crack of autonomy would become the foundation for one of the most remarkable survival systems ever built under captivity. The men at Changi were not passive sufferers. Almost immediately, they began to organize. A full military hierarchy was maintained. British, Australian, and Indian units kept their command structures intact. Officers continued to hold morning briefings, issued orders, and maintained discipline. But beneath this official structure, something even more extraordinary bloomed. The men started building an underground civilization. At the center of it all was a figure who would become legendary, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Weary Dunlop. He was an Australian surgeon, a giant of a man with a quiet voice and hands steady enough to perform surgery in a mud-floored hut lit by a single oil lamp. Dunlop arrived in Changi as a medical officer and immediately began fighting, not with weapons but with every ounce of his authority and his sheer physical presence, for the lives of the men under his care. The medical situation was dire. Tropical diseases flourished in the overcrowded barracks. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, pellagra, and tropical ulcers bloomed on bodies already weakened by starvation. But here is the thing about the human body under siege: it wants to live. And men like Dunlop understood that survival required more than just treating the physical wounds. It required giving men a reason to get up in the morning. So across Changi, prisoners began to build that reason, piece by piece, in secret and in plain sight. And it is here that our real story begins. Because the question isn't just how these men survived the beatings, the disease, and the starvation. It's how they built libraries, how they organized secret universities with 3,000 students, how they ran underground newspapers, broadcast hidden radios, and staged full theatrical productions with handmade costumes and sets, how they kept count of every single day for 3.5 years, scratching tally marks into bamboo walls, never knowing if rescue would come tomorrow or never. It is the story of a small group of men who realized that their minds were the one thing their captors could not take. Unless, of course, the captors got suspicious. But the Japanese were watching, and in the fall of 1942, they would issue an order that ripped thousands of men from the fragile world they had built at Changi and sent them north, deep into the jungles of Siam and Burma. Their destination was a construction project so brutal, so poorly planned, and so relentlessly deadly that the British government would eventually classify the information about it as a state secret, fearing the public would not be able to handle the truth. They were going to build a railway, and the Japanese commandant in charge of the project had made his philosophy perfectly clear. The Japanese will carry out their schedule and do not mind if the line is dotted with crosses. That railway and the crosses that lined it will be waiting for us in Act 2. But before we go there, you need to see the world they built first. Because the survival systems they created in Changi We're about to be tested in one of the most lethal environments on Earth. But before we follow those doomed trains north, we need to understand what survival actually looked like on the ground. Because the men who built the railway didn't emerge from nothing. They came from places like Changi, where they had spent months learning an entirely new kind of warfare. A war fought not with bullets, but with organization, secrecy, and what one officer later called the weapon of culture. Let's start with the most basic, urgent problem. When 40,000 men are packed into a space built for a fraction of that number, how do you stop disease from wiping out everyone in the first month? The answer was sanitation, enforced with military rigor. The prisoners at Changi organized themselves into work parties almost immediately. They dug drainage ditches. They built new latrines, far from the living quarters, using a system of deep trenches and bamboo screens. They established a fly control campaign that bordered on obsessive, understanding that every fly was a potential carrier of dysentery that could kill a man in a week. Officers conducted daily inspections. Men who failed to wash their mess tins were disciplined. This was not about cleanliness as a moral virtue. It was about the cold, hard mathematics of survival. And the proof was in the numbers that would emerge later. During the entire period of Japanese occupation at Changi itself, fewer than 900 prisoners died out of the tens of thousands held there. Compare that to what was coming, and the significance becomes staggering. These systems, however primitive, were saving lives every single day. But survival of the body was only one front. The prisoners quickly realized they were fighting a war for their minds as well. And this is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. Men began, in secret and in plain sight, to build an entire civilization inside the wire. It started with the simplest thing, a book. When the barracks at Changi were evacuated, soldiers managed to carry a few precious volumes, a Bible, a technical manual, a worn copy of Shakespeare. These few books were the seed of something vast. A British officer named Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toucey, who would later become famous for his role on the railway, was one of the early architects of Changi's cultural resistance. But the real engine driving it was the collective will of thousands of men who refused to let their minds atrophy. Within months, an underground library system had developed. The word underground is important here because the Japanese officially forbade any literature that could be considered subversive, which is to say, almost all literature. Anything that might promote Western ideas, anything that might give the prisoners hope, anything that might educate them, it was all banned. So the prisoners hid their books. They smuggled them into the camp piece by piece. Some were brought in by local Chinese and Malay civilians who risked their lives to pad small volumes through the wire. Others were acquired through a network of bribery and barter with guards who could be bought for the right price. And the prisoners didn't just read. They started a library system with catalogs, borrowing cards, and overdue fines. The camp library at Changi eventually held thousands of volumes, circulating through the barracks with the same quiet discipline as a public library in peacetime. Men formed reading groups. They discussed philosophy, history, engineering. They taught themselves languages. They memorized poetry and recited it to each other in the stifling heat of the tropical night. Why does this matter? Because it gave them something that their captors could not take away, an interior life, a sense that they were still thinking beings, still connected to a world beyond the bamboo walls. But the hunger for knowledge went far deeper than casual reading. From this makeshift library, one of the most remarkable institutions of the entire war was born. The prisoners created a university, not a metaphor, not a loose collection of study groups, an actual, functioning university with departments, curricula, exams, and graduating classes. They called it the Changi University, a name spoken only in whispers, because if the Japanese had discovered its true scale, the consequences would have been catastrophic. At its peak, the university had over 3,000 students. Think about that. 3,000 men, most of them young soldiers in their early 20s, spending their captivity studying mathematics, agriculture, engineering, law, history, and at least 7 different languages. The faculty was drawn from the prisoners themselves, professors who had been academics before the war, engineers who knew hydraulics and construction, lawyers who could teach contract law, businessmen who understood accounting, artists and musicians who could lecture on aesthetics. Men who had never taught a day in their lives suddenly became passionate instructors, discovering that the act of teaching was itself a form of survival. It forced them to focus, to prepare, to think about something other than the gnawing hunger and the uncertainty of their fate. The classes were held in any space that could be commandeered: a corner of a barrack, under a tree, in the shade of a building where the afternoon sun didn't quite reach. Lectures were delivered in murmurs, notes taken on scraps of paper, on the backs of cigarette packets, on banana leaves when nothing else was available. Textbooks were precious beyond measure. A single engineering manual would be passed from student to student, its pages growing more fragile with each reading. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, were constantly searching for signs of organized resistance. A university was absolutely the kind of organized activity they would have crushed. So the university operated with a network of lookouts, men stationed at the corners of the parade ground, ostensibly just loitering, who would signal at the first sign of a Japanese patrol. At the signal, the lecture would dissolve. Books would disappear into hidden compartments dug under the floorboards. The professor would become just another prisoner, staring at the sky, and the students would scatter. The Japanese never found out the full extent of what was happening. Not until after the war. But books were only one half of the information war. The prisoners also needed news from the outside world, and this required a level of technical daring that placed men's lives directly on the line. They built radios, secret radios, assembled from components salvaged, stolen, and smuggled into the camp at enormous risk. A wire was taken from a broken truck. A capacitor was bribed off a local laborer. A headphone speaker was hidden in the false bottom of a water bottle. The radio sets themselves were tiny, fragile things, often no bigger than a fist, capable of picking up shortwave broadcasts from Allied stations in India and, later, from the BBC. The men who operated these radios were a special breed. They knew that if they were caught, the punishment would be immediate execution. The Kempeitai had made that brutally clear. In one camp, when a radio was discovered, the Japanese lined up the prisoners and beheaded the suspected operators in front of the entire camp as a warning. So the radio operators lived with a kind of constant, humming fear that never went away. They hid their equipment in the most ingenious places, inside a hollowed-out broom handle, buried in a tin beneath the latrine, sealed inside the leg of a wooden bed frame. Each broadcast was a covert operation. Men would gather in a small group, one man pressing a headphone to his ear, another standing watch, the rest leaning in to catch the whispered summary. The news was then transcribed onto tiny slips of paper and distributed through the camp by couriers who memorized the headlines and repeated them verbatim as they walked. The prisoners knew, well before their guards, that the tide of the war was turning. They knew about Midway. They knew about the Allied landings in North Africa. They knew about the German surrender at Stalingrad. And later, they would know about the liberation of Paris, the fall of Berlin, and the slow, grinding approach of American forces across the Pacific. This knowledge was oxygen. It was proof that the world outside had not forgotten them. It allowed the officers to plan, to make decisions about when to cooperate with the Japanese and when to resist, based on real strategic information rather than blind hope. The radio operators and the news couriers formed the nervous system of the camp's resistance. Without them, the isolation would have been absolute. With them, the prisoners could endure almost anything, because they knew that somewhere, far away, the forces that would eventually free them were getting stronger every day. But survival wasn't just a matter of secret information and high culture. There was also the daily business of simply not starving to death. The Japanese provided rations that were, by any standard, lethally inadequate. The standard issue was a small amount of rice, sometimes supplemented with a few vegetables, occasionally a tiny piece of dried fish. Caloric intake for a working prisoner was often below 1,500 calories a day, and sometimes much less. Men lost weight at an alarming rate. In the first months of captivity, the average prisoner dropped 30, 40, 50 pounds. Their bodies began to consume their own muscle tissue. The first signs of deficiency diseases appeared within weeks. Beriberi, caused by a lack of thiamine, made men's limbs swell grotesquely and their hearts struggle to pump. Pellagra, from niacin deficiency, produced the characteristic butterfly-shaped rash across the face and the slow unraveling of the mind. Scurvy made old wounds reopen and teeth loosen in their sockets. Night blindness became so common that men had to be led around the camp after dark by their healthier comrades. Facing this constant, grinding hunger, the prisoners became experts in the economics of survival. Every scrap of food was precious. The rice ration, doled out at the cookhouse, was measured with obsessive precision. Men would scrape every last grain from their mess tins with a finger, licking it clean until the tin shone. If a piece of fish appeared in the stew, it was divided with surgical fairness. Men developed an elaborate system of dividing portions. One man would divide the food into equal piles, and the other men would choose their pile first. This ensured that the divider was absolutely precise, because any mistake would come back to him. This simple rule, applied over thousands of meals, prevented the kind of fights over food that could have torn the camp apart. The prisoners also began, whenever possible, to supplement their rations. They grew vegetable gardens in every spare patch of earth, raising greens that provided essential vitamins. The gardens at Changi became legendary, sprawling across the former parade grounds, tended by men who had been accountants and mechanics before the war, and who discovered a newfound passion for horticulture. They raised chickens and pigs on scraps. They built makeshift ovens and learned to make something resembling bread from rice flour. The officers' mess, operating under the Japanese radar, developed its own version of haute cuisine using the most limited ingredients imaginable. There is a recorded menu from one battalion that listed rice risotto, garden greens sautéed in coconut oil, and a fruit compote of stolen papaya. The description was a joke, a shared act of imagination among men who knew they were eating weeds and scraps. But the joke itself was the point. It was a refusal to be reduced to the level of animals. And this brings us to the thing that, more than any other single factor, kept these men from collapsing into despair. They built a world of entertainment, a theatrical world so elaborate, so professional, and so defiantly joyful that it strained belief. At Changi, the prisoners converted a section of the barracks into a theater. The stage was made from salvaged timber. The curtains from discarded blankets dyed with boot polish. The costumes were sewn from old uniforms, rice sacks, and whatever scraps of fabric could be found. The makeup was improvised from charcoal, powdered chalk, and burnt cork. And on this stage, the men performed. They performed Shakespeare. They performed Noel Coward comedies. They wrote and staged their own musicals. There was an all-male production of The Merry Widow that became the stuff of legend, with a 6'4" Australian gunner playing the female lead with such conviction that men in the audience forgot, for a few precious hours, where they were. There was a concert party called the Changi Follies, complete with a full orchestra of instruments built from scrap wood, wire, and tin. And the Japanese guards, to the astonishment of the prisoners, often came to watch. They would stand at the back of the audience, faces impassive, watching their captives perform Western music and drama. Perhaps they were curious, perhaps they were bored, perhaps the power of the entertainment transcended, for a moment, the brutality of the system that contained it. Whatever the reason, the shows went on, night after night, for 3.5 years. But the theater was only the most visible form of entertainment. There was also music everywhere. Men built violins and cellos in secret workshops. They formed choirs that rehearsed in the relative safety of the latrines, where the acoustics were surprisingly good, and the Japanese guards, understandably, didn't linger. A prisoner named Ernest van Heerden, a South African concert pianist, organized a series of classical music lectures in which he would hum entire Beethoven symphonies from memory, while another prisoner transcribed the notes onto scraps of paper. By the end of the war, Van Heerden had reconstructed, purely from memory, the full scores of several major classical works, which would later be performed in the camp by the prisoner orchestra. The Japanese never knew they were holding a full symphony in their midst. There was also a thriving economy of small comforts. Men who were skilled with their hands became the camp's artisans. A watchmaker repaired broken timepieces using tools he had made from salvaged metal. A cobbler resoled boots with strips of old tires. A tailor could turn a worn-out uniform into a presentable shirt. These services were traded for food, for tobacco, for the small luxuries that made life bearable. The camp even developed its own currency. Not official money, but a system of credit based on reputation and recorded in ledgers kept by trusted officers. A man could buy a bar of soap, a needle and thread, a shave from the camp barber, all on credit, and settle his debts when the next Red Cross package arrived, or when he was paid his meager wages from a work party. This financial system, as rudimentary as it was, gave the prisoners a sense of agency. They were not just passive recipients of suffering. They were economic actors in a small, closed world of their own making. And then there was the spiritual life of the camp. Chaplains held services in the open air, the congregation sitting on the ground, the altar a wooden crate covered with a scrap of cloth. Men of all faiths attended, not always because they were devout, but because the ritual itself was a connection to home, to family, to a moral universe in which their suffering might have meaning. The padres provided more than just religious services. They were counselors, listening to confessions of despair and fear that men could not share with their commanding officers. They sat with the dying in the camp hospital, holding hands, whispering prayers, writing final letters that would never be sent. The best of them had a kind of quiet courage that asked nothing in return. And in a world where every man was struggling to survive, that kind of selflessness was a form of moral leadership that held the community together. But for all the libraries and universities and orchestras, the most essential survival tool was perhaps the simplest. It was a calendar, or rather, thousands of calendars, scratched into the walls of barracks, etched into the backs of mess tins, tattooed in small dots of ink on arms and hands. The men kept count. Every day, another mark. Every day, closer to an unknown but certain end. The act of marking time was a declaration. It said, "I am still here. I am still sane. I have not forgotten that this will end." Some men kept elaborate diaries, hidden at risk of death, recording the events of each day in tiny handwriting on toilet paper or cigarette wrappers. These diaries, many of which survived the war, provide an unvarnished, daily record of what it felt like to exist in this suspended state between life and death. The diarists wrote about the food. They wrote about their dreams. They wrote about the rumors that swept through the camp like weather. And they wrote about the numbers, the daily death count, the names of the men who had been in the next bunk and were suddenly gone. There is a passage from one Australian diary, dated April 1943, that reads simply, "Rained all day. Rice ration cut again. Jenkins died at dawn. Heard on the grapevine that the Americans have landed somewhere. Marked the wall. 212 days. 212 days. The patience of that. The endurance of that. And yet, the men at Changi were the fortunate ones. Because in June of 1942, the Japanese High Command made a decision that would turn a terrible situation into an apocalyptic one. They needed a railway, a supply line running from Thailand through the mountains and jungles of Burma to feed their armies fighting the British in India. The terrain was considered impassable by Western engineers. The mountains were steep, the rivers fast, the jungle dense and teeming with disease. The British had surveyed the route years earlier and concluded that building a railway through that country would take at least 5 years and require an immense amount of heavy equipment. The Japanese decided to do it in 18 months, using human labor instead of machines. The first wave of prisoners selected for what would become known as the Burma Railway left Changi in the summer of 1942. They were loaded onto trains, packed so tightly into metal freight cars that men fainted from the heat. The journey took 5 days. No food was provided. Men drank the sweat from their own arms. Some died in the cars, their bodies propped up by the living because there was no room for them to fall. When the doors finally opened, the prisoners stumbled out blinking into the jungle light and found themselves in a world that was almost unimaginably alien. They would be based at camps with names like Konyu 3 and Hintok Mountain. They would be worked from dawn until well after dark, cutting through solid rock with hand tools, carrying 100-pound loads of earth and stone through mud that sucked at their legs like quicksand. They would die in their thousands from cholera, which could kill a man in less than 24 hours, his body turning blue and writhing as his fluids poured out of him. They would die from tropical ulcers that ate through flesh to the bone. They would die from exhaustion, from beatings, from the sheer accumulated weight of suffering that the human body simply could not process. But even here, in what one survivor called the University of Horror, the systems of survival that had been built in Changi would prove their worth. The men who understood hygiene built latrines and boiled water, and the death rates in their units were lower. The men who could organize, who could maintain discipline, who could hold on to the idea that they were soldiers and not animals, survived in greater numbers. The radio operators, when they could, continued to pass along news. The doctors, led by Weary Dunlop, performed miracles with no medicine and no equipment, and the men who had learned to mark their calendars in Changi kept marking them, now in mud-walled huts in the jungle, counting the days until the railway was finished, or until they were simply finished. The Japanese had promised that the line would be completed in 18 months. It would be completed, finally, in October of 1943. But by then, more than 12,000 Allied prisoners would be dead, along with uncounted tens of thousands of Asian forced laborers. And the crosses that lined the track would stretch, quite literally, from one end of the line to the other. That is where we are going next. To the railway, to the Speedo period, to the Hellfire Pass, and to the men who looked into the abyss and somehow, against all probability, found a way to keep walking. Let's pick up the story as the first work battalions arrived at the railway construction camps in the summer of 1942. Imagine stepping out of a cramped, sweltering freight car into a wall of green. The jungle in this part of Southeast Asia is not the passive backdrop of a nature documentary. It is an active, predatory force. The heat wraps around you like a wet blanket, and within minutes your clothes are soaked through with sweat. The air hums with mosquitoes and the constant, droning buzz of insects. The mud beneath your feet is ankle-deep in places, a thick, sucking ooze that pulls at your boots with every step. And the sound of the jungle at night is a cacophony of shrieks, croaks, and the unnerving rustle of things moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. This was the world the prisoners were dropped into. No barracks had been built, no kitchens, no latrines. The Japanese command expected the prisoners to build the infrastructure for their own imprisonment from scratch, using bamboo, palm fronds, and raw muscle, while simultaneously beginning work on the railway. The men called the rudimentary huts they built basha, a corruption of a Malay word, and they were little more than raised bamboo platforms under a leaky thatch roof. At night, men slept packed together like firewood, trying to keep warm when the jungle temperature dropped, trying to avoid the rats that ran across their faces, trying to ignore the bedbugs and lice that infested every crack and fold. The work began at dawn and ended, for the first few months, at dusk. The prisoners were divided into teams of around 40 men, each under a Japanese engineer or a Korean guard whose primary motivation was speed. The task was to clear a path through virgin jungle, then level the ground, then lay sleepers and rails. They had no machinery. They used change coals, a kind of heavy hoe, to break the earth. They used woven baskets to carry the soil and rock, balanced on their shoulders, often climbing up and down steep embankments that turned to sliding mud in the monsoon. They felled trees by hand and dragged the logs to the track using ropes and raw manpower. The pace was relentless. If a man stumbled, he was kicked. If he fell, he was beaten until he got up, or until it became clear he was not going to get up at all. The guards carried bamboo sticks and rifle butts and used them freely, sometimes in casual punishment, sometimes in what appeared to be spontaneous eruptions of rage. Any prisoner who looked the guard in the eye, or who did not understand an order, shouted in Japanese, or who was simply at the end of the line when the guard felt like hitting someone, received a beating that often left him unconscious in the mud. The Japanese engineers, the real drivers of the project, participated in this violence with a cold, professional dispassion. They had a railway to build, and every minute lost was a minute the generals would answer for. One engineer, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Nagatomo, regularly stood on a box and shouted at the prisoners that they were animals, that they were cowards who had surrendered instead of dying for their countries, and that they would work until they dropped. What Nagatomo and his colleagues didn't say, but what every prisoner quickly understood, was that there was no plan for their survival. The work was the priority. The men were simply a resource to be consumed and replaced. And then, in the spring of 1943, the pace accelerated into a period that the prisoners called Speedo. The Japanese High Command, frustrated by delays caused by the impossible terrain and the monsoon, ordered that the railway be completed by August, months ahead of the original schedule. The working day was extended. Now the men rose in darkness at 3 in the morning, swallowed a bowl of watery rice, and began the march to the cutting site. They worked until 8 or 9 at night, and on some sections through the night by torchlight. The guards, under enormous pressure themselves, became even more violent. The beatings increased. The food ration, already minuscule, was sometimes cut as punishment for falling behind schedule. And the monsoon arrived, turning the jungle into a steaming, dripping nightmare, where men worked in chest-deep water, where mudslides buried sections of track and had to be cleared by hand, and where the rain never stopped, day after day, until every man's skin was permanently white and wrinkled, and the jungle rot began to eat at their feet. This is the moment to talk about the Hellfire Pass. The name comes from the most notorious section of the entire railway, a deep cutting through solid rock at a place called Konyu in Thailand. The prisoners had to carve a passage through a mountain spur, and because the rock was too hard for picks, they drilled holes by hand with sledgehammers and steel bars, packed them with dynamite, and then cleared the shattered rock with their bare hands and baskets. The cutting was so deep that the sun barely reached the bottom, and at night the work was lit by bamboo torches and small fires. The scene, according to every survivor who endured it, was a vision of hell. The naked torsos of skeletal men, glistening with sweat and rain, moving in and out of the shadows, the rhythmic ring of hammers, the occasional scream as a man's hand was crushed between two rocks, the crack of rifle butts on flesh, the Japanese engineers shouting and driving the pace faster and faster. Men died at Hellfire Pass in staggering numbers. They died from exhaustion, their hearts simply stopping after a 16-hour shift. They died from rockfalls. They died from cholera, which swept through the camp and killed men in their huts while they lay in their own filth, too weak to move. At its worst, the death rate across the railway reached 20 men per day, a statistic that the Japanese officers noted in their reports. With the same detachment, they noted the daily progress of the track. But it is precisely here, in the deepest pit of suffering, that the survival systems built in Changi were tested and refined into their most essential form. The prisoners on the railway could not access books or stage plays. They could not build a university, but they could remember. The men who had studied engineering in Changi used their knowledge to build better drainage in the camp, reducing mosquito breeding grounds. The men who had learned hygiene discipline dug latrines downslope from the water source and enforced strict rules about hand washing, rules that cost nothing but attention and saved countless lives from dysentery. And above all, they organized medical care that, under any rational assessment, should not have been possible. The doctors on the railway became the absolute moral center of the camps. Lieutenant Colonel Weary Dunlop, who arrived in the first wave of prisoners, is the most famous, but there were many others. Dutch physicians trained in tropical medicine, British regimental surgeons, Australian orderlies who learned on the job and became skilled practitioners. Their hospital was a long hut with a dirt floor and bamboo platforms for beds. They had almost no medicine. The Japanese provided a trickle of quinine and bandages, far too little to make any difference. So the doctors improvised. They made saline drips from bamboo tubes and old rubber tubing, sterilizing them by boiling them in tin cans over open fires. They performed amputations with a carpenter's saw, sharpened and cleaned as best they could. They treated tropical ulcers, which could eat a man's leg to the bone in a matter of weeks, by scraping out the necrotic tissue with a sharpened spoon and then, when possible, applying maggots to clean the wound. The maggots, carefully bred in a hidden spot away from the Japanese, ate the dead flesh and left the living tissue intact. It was grotesque, but it saved limbs and lives. Dunlop himself kept meticulous surgical records in a tiny notebook hidden in his clothing, and his calm, towering presence in the hospital hut gave dying men a sense, however fragile, that someone was still in control. The radio network also continued to function, though in an even more dangerous form. At the railway camps, a few operators maintained contact with the outside world by bribing guards or local Thais for parts. In one camp, the radio was hidden inside a hollowed-out log that had been carefully sealed with wax to keep out moisture. In another, it was buried in a grave, the operator digging it up at night to listen for news. The information they received was a lifeline. In the summer of 1943, the prisoners learned that Mussolini had fallen. Later, they heard about the invasion of Normandy. Each piece of news was passed from hut to hut in whispers, providing what one survivor called a secret calendar of hope. But the danger was constant. The Kempeitai conducted sporadic raids, lining up prisoners and beating them to extract confessions about radios. A few operators were caught and executed on the spot. The survivors knew the cost, and they continued anyway. As the railway neared completion in October of 1943, the survivors might have expected some relief. Instead, the Japanese simply shifted them to new work. Some were moved to build roads, bridges, and airstrips in other parts of Southeast Asia. Others were packed into the holds of ships and sent to Japan, Korea, and Manchuria to work in mines, factories, and shipyards. And this is where the story takes another, even darker turn. Because the transportation itself became a new and lethal threat, the prisoners were loaded onto what they called hellships, cargo vessels that were not marked with the Red Cross and that often carried military supplies in their holds. The men were packed into the lower decks in conditions of almost unimaginable squalor, without light, without ventilation, and with barely enough food and water to keep them alive. They were at the mercy of the tropical heat, and many died of suffocation and thirst before the ship even left port. But the real horror came from the sky. Allied submarines and aircraft, patrolling the Pacific, had no way of knowing that these unmarked cargo ships carried their own comrades. Throughout 1944 and 45, a series of appalling tragedies unfolded. The Tamahoko Maru was torpedoed, drowning hundreds of prisoners. The Arisen Maru went down with over 1,700 aboard, the worst single loss of American lives at sea. The Junyo Maru was sunk, killing more than 5,000 prisoners and forced laborers. In total, thousands of Allied prisoners who had survived the jungle and the railway perished in the open ocean, some within sight of rescuers who had no idea who they were firing at. Survivors who managed to cling to wreckage sometimes watched Japanese patrol boats, machine gun swimmers in the water. It was a massacre, and one that the prisoners had no defense against. The very forces that were coming to liberate them were unwittingly killing them. By the spring of 1945, the men who remained in the camps across the Japanese Empire were living ghosts. Rations had been cut again as Japan's own supplies collapsed. Medical supplies were non-existent. The guards, sensing that the war was lost, became more unpredictable, some anxious and slightly less brutal, others doubling down on cruelty out of a kind of desperate rage. And then, in the summer, the prisoners began to hear whispers of a chilling new possibility. The Japanese military had issued standing orders that if the Allies attempted to invade the home islands, all prisoners of war were to be executed immediately. In some camps, the prisoners were marched into remote areas and told that they would be killed if the Allies landed. In Japan itself, thousands were working in mines and factories with the knowledge that their very presence made them targets in the coming invasion. The calculated plan, later revealed in captured documents, was to eliminate all witnesses to the Empire's war crimes before the enemy could arrive. For men who had survived 3.5 years of starvation, disease, and sadistic violence, the final months became a race between liberation and annihilation. And then, in August of 1945, the impossible happened. The news spread through the camps in disjointed fragments like a radio signal struggling through static. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki. Russia had declared war. The Emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his voice heard for the first time by his subjects, announcing that Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. In some camps, the Japanese officers simply vanished overnight, leaving the gates open, and the prisoners staring at empty guard towers. In others, the guards remained at their posts, uncertain, waiting for orders. Many prisoners, conditioned by years of brutality and deception, did not believe the news. They thought it might be a trap, a pretext for mass execution. They waited, tension crackling in the air. As the days passed and planes began to appear overhead, planes that did not drop bombs, but instead dropped canisters of food, medicine, and leaflets with a single, stunning message: "You are free." The liberation, when it finally came, was not the clean, triumphant moment the history books describe. It was messy, bewildering, and for many men, the hardest part of all. Because after years of dreaming about freedom, they suddenly had to face a question that none of their secret radios or hidden universities had prepared them for. What do you do when the nightmare is over, but the nightmare is all you can remember? The planes came in low, so low that the men could see the faces of the pilots. They were American, Australian, British, faces that belonged to a world the prisoners had been dreaming about for 3.5 years. The planes didn't drop bombs. They dropped parachutes with canisters that drifted down into the clearing, landing with soft thuds in the mud. The prisoners stumbled out of their huts, hollow-eyed and barefoot, staring at the sky as if it had cracked open. Some were too weak to walk. Others were too stunned to cry. When the first soldier from a liberation team stepped through the gates of a camp near Nagasaki, he was met by a skeleton in a loincloth, standing at attention, who said, very quietly, "You are the most beautiful sight I have ever seen." And then the skeleton collapsed. The liberation of the Japanese prisoner of war camps was not a single event, but a cascade of delayed miracles spread across the autumn of 1945. In Manchuria, in Singapore, in Thailand, in Japan itself, tens of thousands of men, along with civilian internees, women, and children, were gradually reached, counted, and confronted with the shocking reality that they had survived. The numbers were staggering. The Allied forces recovered over 37,000 Australian prisoners, more than 30,000 British, nearly 25,000 Americans, and over 40,000 Dutch and Dutch colonial troops. Most of them were unrecognizable from the men who had marched into captivity. The average prisoner had lost between 30 and 60% of his body weight. Vitamin deficiencies had left the survivors with permanent nerve damage, ruined eyesight, and hearts that would never fully recover. Tuberculosis was rampant. The hospitals that had fought so hard to keep men alive were now overwhelmed with the task of stabilizing them for transport. The medical teams who arrived in those first weeks came with food, medicine, and a horror they could barely process. They found weary Dunlop still operating in his mud-floored hospital in Thailand, a giant of a man who had lost nearly half his own body weight, but who was still working, still recording his cases in that tiny notebook, still using maggots because the proper medical supplies had not yet arrived. He greeted the liberators with a handshake and a request for more suture material. His surgical records, painstakingly maintained through years of deprivation, became both a medical marvel and legal evidence. They showed not only the ingenuity of the camp doctors but also the systematic neglect and brutality that had caused so many of the wounds they were forced to treat. In the weeks after liberation, Dunlop refused to be evacuated until every man under his care had been seen to. He had entered the camp weighing 230 pounds. He left it weighing 97. And it was only after the gates swung open that the full extent of the secret civilization began to emerge from the shadows. The liberators discovered the radios, still hidden, still capable of picking up signals. They found the diaries, thousands of them, some written in microscopic script on toilet paper, some scratched into bamboo slats, some sewn into the linings of ragged uniforms. They found the library at Changi, still organized, still catalogued, its thousands of volumes having survived inspection after inspection because the Japanese guards had never paused to question why a group of starving prisoners was so attached to a battered copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream. They found the records of the Changi University, handwritten rosters of 3,000 students and hundreds of courses, the final examinations that had been graded in secret, the diplomas that had been issued on scraps of paper and hidden in boots. The Japanese had been holding a fully functioning university in what they thought was a slave camp. It remains one of the most extraordinary reversals in the history of warfare. But not everything could be recovered. The men who had operated the radios came forward, some to receive quiet commendation, others to reveal their roles for the first time. They spoke of the terror of the Kempeitai raids, the nights listening with a headphone pressed against one ear while a lookout strained for footsteps. They revealed the locations where their equipment had been buried, and several of the radios were dug up and preserved as artifacts. One set, pulled from a hollow log in Thailand, still had the faint scratch marks where a prisoner had carved his initials. Another was found sealed in a tin beneath a latrine, exactly where it had been buried 3 years earlier. These devices, built from stolen wire and salvaged capacitors, had been the prisoners' one connection to the outside world, and they had worked. The reckoning for the perpetrators came quickly. The war crimes trials in the Pacific were extensive, and the testimony of prisoners formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The man who had overseen the Bataan Death March, General Masaharu Homma, was tried in Manila and executed by firing squad in 1946. Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, who had accepted Percival's surrender, faced a military tribunal for atrocities committed by his troops, including the brutality in the camps. He was found guilty under a precedent that became known as command responsibility the idea that a commander is responsible for the actions of his subordinates. He was hanged in February of 1946. Lieutenant Colonel Nakatomo, the engineer who had shouted at prisoners that they were animals, was tried in Singapore. The prisoners he had abused testified against him with the calm precision of men who had kept careful mental records. He was executed. Dozens of other camp guards, Korean conscripts, and junior officers faced trials and punishment, though many more simply disappeared into the chaos of the post-war world. The Japanese High Command's attempt to destroy records of the camps failed in part because the prisoners themselves had kept such meticulous documentation. Their diaries, their secret photographs, their hidden medical records, all of it became evidence that could not be denied. The men who came home were not the same men who had left. The physical recovery took years, and for some, it never fully arrived. The starvation left its mark in the form of chronic digestive disorders, damaged livers, and nervous systems that misfired unpredictably. Tropical diseases that had been suppressed but never cured flared up again in the cold climate of England or the American Midwest. The psychological wounds were even harder to treat, partly because the vocabulary to describe them barely existed. The term post-traumatic stress was decades away. Men were simply told to get on with it, to put the war behind them, to be grateful they had survived. Many could not. They woke up screaming. They could not stand to be in crowded rooms. They could not eat rice. The smell of boiled cabbage could trigger a panic attack because it reminded them of the cookhouse. The sound of a car backfiring could send them diving for cover. Their families, who had waited years for their return, found themselves living with strangers who sometimes stared at walls for hours, who wept at unexpected moments, who could not explain what they had seen because the words had not been invented. There was also a profound silence. In Britain, the men who had fought in the Far East were sometimes called the Forgotten Army. The war in Europe had dominated the public imagination. D-Day, the Battle of Britain, the liberation of Paris, these were the stories that filled the newspapers and the newsreels. The men who had survived Changi and the railway and the hell ships came back to a country that did not want to hear about their suffering, partly because it was too horrific, and partly because the civilians had their own traumas to process. The prisoners learned to keep quiet. They did not talk about the maggots or the beatings or the friends who had died in their arms. They did not mention the beheadings or the sun treatment or the sound of a man's bones breaking under a rifle butt. They married. They had children. They went to work, and they carried the weight of their memories in silence. The diaries that had been so carefully kept were often locked away in attics, unread, for decades. And yet, even in the silence, the legacy of the survival systems began to surface in quieter ways. Some of the men who had taught classes in Changi returned to their professions and became influential educators. The engineers who had built drainage systems in the jungle used those skills in post-war reconstruction. The doctors who had invented surgical techniques with spoons and bamboo went on to train a new generation of physicians. Weary Dunlop became a revered figure in Australia, a symbol of quiet, unbreakable decency. He rarely spoke of his own suffering, but he spent the rest of his life advocating for the welfare of former prisoners and for reconciliation with Japan. His statue now stands in Melbourne, a tall, thin man in a slouch hat looking toward the future. The physical scars of the railway remain visible in the jungle to this day. The cuttings at Hellfire Pass have been preserved as a memorial, managed by the Australian government, and thousands of visitors walk the track every year. The bamboo and wood of the original bridges and huts have long since rotted away, reclaimed by the jungle, but the rock cuttings remain, the marks of hand drills still visible on the stone walls. At Kanchanaburi, in Thailand, a museum holds some of the artifacts recovered from the camps: the mess tins, the diaries, the musical instruments. One of the violins built in the camp is still playable, its tone dark and resonant, and every year on Anzac Day, Surviving veterans and their descendants gather at memorials across Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia, still counting the years, still marking the days. But perhaps the most haunting detail is the one that was discovered long after the war, in a warehouse in Tokyo. When the camps were liberated, the advancing troops found thousands of unopened mail bags, filled with letters and packages that had been sent by families to the prisoners and simply never delivered. The Japanese authorities had warehoused them, hoarding them for reasons that remain unclear. The letters were filled with news of births and deaths, with photographs of children who had grown up while their fathers were in captivity, with the mundane details of daily life that the prisoners had been so desperate to read. The men had spent years dreaming of home, not knowing that the proof of home was sitting just a few miles away, deliberately withheld. When the mail bags were eventually opened and the letters forwarded, many of the recipients had already died. Some of the letters arrived years after the war ended, a final, bittersweet echo of a connection that had been severed by cruelty and bureaucracy. The story of the Allied prisoners in Japanese camps is not a simple story of triumph over evil. It is a story about the specific, granular, unglamorous work of staying alive. It is about men who counted calories and built latrines and hid radio parts in broom handles, not because they were heroes, but because they wanted to see home again. It is about the quiet, stubborn, sometimes absurd acts of culture, the plays, the orchestras, the lectures on Shakespeare and soil chemistry, that reminded them they were still human when every external force was trying to convince them otherwise. And it reminds us that survival is rarely a single heroic moment. It is a long, slow, collective effort, sustained by the people who keep counting, who keep teaching, who keep singing, who keep believing that the future will arrive even when the present offers no evidence. As we move toward the final chapter of their story, we are left with a single, quiet question. After surviving so much, how do you ever truly go home? And what does it mean to be free when the prison you built in your mind is the one you cannot escape? That question has no easy answer, and for the men who came back, it was a question they would spend the rest of their lives trying to answer. The physical homecoming was the easy part. The ships docked, the bands played, the families wept and embraced them. But the real homecoming happened in the quiet hours that followed, when the former prisoners sat alone in their childhood bedrooms or their unfamiliar new houses and realized that the jungle was still with them. It was in the way they flinched at sudden noises, in the way they hoarded food in their pockets, in the way they woke up at 3 in the morning, the hour when the work shift had started at Hellfire Pass, and could not go back to sleep. One British veteran who had been a young lieutenant in Singapore wrote decades later, "I left the camp in 1945, but the camp never entirely left me. It is a room in my mind that I visit every day." That room was furnished with the faces of the dead, the sound of the bamboo sticks cracking, the smell of the jungle after rain, and the faint, persistent, miraculous hope that something better was waiting on the other side. But here is the strange, unexpected thing. For many of these men, the camp also contained the most intensely meaningful moments of their lives. Not the suffering, but the connection. The friendships they formed in the mud and the starvation were of a kind that peacetime rarely offers. The men who had shared their last spoonful of rice, who had carried a sick friend to the latrine in the middle of the night, who had whispered news from the secret radio to men they barely knew, these bonds became the defining relationships of their lives. When they returned to their families, they often found it difficult to explain why they missed the people they had been imprisoned with. Not the place, never the place, but the solidarity, the absolute clarity of purpose, the knowledge that every small act of kindness mattered because it might be the last thing a dying man ever received. In a world that seemed to them increasingly shallow and distracted, the camp remained a place of terrible, vivid meaning. This paradoxical attachment is not unique to the prisoners of the Japanese. It is a feature of extreme survival experiences across history, but the Pacific prisoners carried it in a particular way, because their survival had been so thoroughly a collective act. No one survived Changi or the railway alone. The radio operators survived because someone stood watch. The doctor survived because someone boiled the water for his instruments. The university student survived because someone taught the class and someone else grew the extra vegetables that kept the teacher from collapsing. The entire system was woven together by thousands of small, quiet debts that could never be fully repaid. And the survivors knew this. They carried a sense of obligation toward each other that lasted until the final veteran gatherings, where old men in blazers and medals would greet each other with a depth of emotion that their grandchildren found both moving and slightly mysterious. The silence that descended on these stories after the war was not just a matter of public indifference. It was also a choice. Many survivors simply could not find the language to describe what they had seen. The events were too extreme, the suffering too raw. They worried that if they started talking, they would not be able to stop. They worried that their families would not believe them, or that they would be pitied, or that they would be seen as damaged. And so they wrapped their memories in a protective shell, revealing them only in fragments, usually late at night, usually after a drink, usually to a fellow veteran who could fill in the gaps from his own experience. The diaries that had been kept with such care in the camps, the tiny notebooks, the toilet paper scrolls, were often locked away in drawers, not because the writers wanted to forget, but because they could not bear to remember alone. Over time, that silence began to break. In the 1980s and 90s, as the veterans reached retirement age and their grandchildren began to ask questions, a wave of memoirs, documentaries, and historical studies emerged. The survivors who had been young men in 1942 were now old men, and they felt the weight of a final responsibility, to bear witness before it was too late. The oral history projects that captured their testimonies are now among the most valuable records we have of the camp experience. And what emerges from those testimonies, again and again, is not just the horror, but the quiet, stubborn, human-scale resistance that we have been tracing all night. The hidden radios, the secret university, the maggot therapy, the calendar scratched into the wall, the concert held in a latrine because the acoustics were good and the guards wouldn't come in. These details are not footnotes to the larger story of suffering. They are the story, and that story offers us something beyond the familiar narrative of victimhood and heroism. It suggests that survival is not simply a matter of enduring pain. It is an active, creative process. It requires imagination. It requires organization. It requires the ability to construct a small, functional world inside a larger, dysfunctional one. The men who survived the Japanese camps were not necessarily the strongest or the toughest. They were the ones who found something to do, a skill to practice, a subject to teach, a joke to tell, a song to hum, a letter to write, even if it would never be sent. They were the ones who kept their minds alive, even as their bodies wasted. And when liberation came, they were the ones who could still recognize it for what it was, because they had never, in the deepest sense, surrendered. And yet, the cost was real. The death rate of 27% for Allied prisoners in Japanese camps is one of the darkest statistics of the entire war. More than 36,000 men died from starvation, disease, overwork, and direct violence. Every single one of those deaths was a world extinguished, and the survivors carried those worlds inside them, a burden that never lightened with time. At the dedication of a memorial at Kanchanaburi, many years after the war, an Australian veteran stood before the gathered crowd and tried to explain what the place meant to him. He faltered, his voice cracking, and finally he said simply, "I can still hear them." He did not need to say who. Everyone there understood. So as you drift off tonight, perhaps to the sound of rain on a window that is not a leaking bamboo roof, perhaps to the quiet hum of a safe, warm room, perhaps to the knowledge that your bed is clean and your stomach is full, Consider what it took for those men to keep hope alive in a place designed to extinguish it. Consider the small, secret acts of resistance, the radio buried in a log, the book passed from hand to hand, the calendar marks scratched on a wall, that added up to something far greater than survival. They added up to a refusal to be erased, a declaration that they were still men, still soldiers, still brothers and fathers and sons, still capable of learning and teaching and laughing and singing, even when everything around them was screaming the opposite. They counted the days. They taught the classes. They played the violins. And in doing so, they won a victory that no army could have taken from them. As for the question of what it means to be free, the answer, perhaps, is that freedom is not a destination you arrive at. It is a practice you maintain, and for 3.5 years, in the camps of the Pacific, a small army of starving men practiced it every single day. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this time with a story that matters. If it spoke to you, consider leaving a like and dropping a comment below. Tell me where you are listening from, what time it is, and what corner of history you'd like to explore next. Subscribe if you want to drift off to more deeply factual stories, quietly told. Sleep well. You've earned it.